So it's interesting to know that MILF porn is actually still much more popular than conspiracy theories. So what we could drive from that, if we wanted to do a false correlation, is that MILF porn won Donald Trump the election, potentially.
Well, you don't know. Maybe it did.
Hello and welcome to Trolling with Logic, where we bring the hammer down on pseudoscience, ignorance, and unreason on a bi-weekly basis. I'm Nathan, your host. Cal and Kitch both were unable to join us for this episode, so today it's just me and Jen. How you doing, Jen?
I'm not too bad, thanks. Just working on a few projects, trying to keep the Illuminati at bay.
Joining us today is our special guest on this episode, Dr. Joseph Uscinski. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami, and his current research focuses on conspiratorial beliefs, which is the topic of this episode. He is the author of The People's News, Media, Politics, and the Demands of Capitalism, and co-author with Joseph Parent of American Conspiracy Theories from Oxford University Press. His research has appeared in several scholarly outlets, including the Journal of Politics, Political Research Quarterly, and Critical Review. Welcome to the show, Dr. Uscinski.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. As I said, we're talking about conspiracy theories in society, and your research specifically focuses on conspiracy beliefs as they crop up in America specifically. To start, there's an important concept you introduce in your book that's based on the psychological work of other people called the conspiracy dimension, and this has been developed by Rob Brotherton, Chris French, and others. Can you describe what the conspiracy dimension is and how it plays into what we're talking about?
So the basic idea is that some people, to one degree or another, are predisposed to believing in conspiracy theories or to not believing in conspiracy theories. So my guess is, and there isn't much research to back this up because psychologists, social psychologists, and political scientists have only been working on the topic for about a decade now. My guess is that this predisposition comes from childhood socialization, just like many of our other political predispositions come from. So if you think about conspiracy theories as explanations of power, who has it and what are they doing with it, it fits in very well to ideas about partisanship or political ideology, other ideas that essentially get to, the notion of who's good and who's bad, who's doing the right thing, which team should we be part of. So since ideas like partisanship and ideology come out of socialization, I assume, unfortunately without much evidence, that this is where this conspiracy thinking, as I call it, comes from.
Why do you think conspiracy theories are difficult to study? The research you and Parent have done kind of bridges a pretty wide gap, or attempts to bridge a pretty wide gap, and where would you say the difficulty comes in?
Well, I give a lot of public talks, and I'll tell you, many people are not convinced of what I say, and not because of anything that I say, but because they have their own conspiracy beliefs that keep them from buying into what I'm talking about. So the reason this happens is because people like to assume that their beliefs are based on sound reasoning and good evidence. Otherwise, we wouldn't hold that belief, right? So when I tell people that, these conspiracy beliefs come from some other place, that isn't based on logic and evidence, they often get offended. So it's hard to have these conversations with people. And I often get confronted by, sometimes it's truthers, sometimes it's birthers. But in any case, it's conspiracy theorists, people who believing in these things don't want to think that it's not evidence that's driving them. That's why it's so hard to have, serious public conversations about it.
And it's interesting that conspiracy theorists, for the most part, as you say, do believe that their views are based on an impartial interpretation of evidence. But at the same time, what I see following different conspiracy theories, because it's one of my special fascinations and special interests in looking into these things, is that they seem to reject the study of their beliefs. It's almost as if they don't want their beliefs subjected to critical scrutiny, but at the same time, they do believe that their views are based on something more than speculation.
Sure. So, I mean, this comes out in different ways. So there's a popular conspiracy theory that the word conspiracy theory is itself part of a conspiracy by the CIA to delegitimize conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination. So, I mean, if you start from that point, you know, you're not going to get very far. And then when I write publicly in a newspaper or something, I'll scan the comments that readers will make, and a lot of the comments from conspiracy theorists will allege that I'm part of the conspiracy, that I'm somehow trying to stop free thought or free debate, or I'm a shill for the establishment. And trust me, I'm not. So
we've had Vance on before, and he's been accused of that as well.
Yeah. So people get very touchy about these beliefs. And it's not all people. I mean, everyone believes in at least one conspiracy theory. Most people probably believe in a few, even if they don't know it. But most people aren't getting upset about the discussion of conspiracy theory. It's certain people who are very much into their beliefs that will take umbrage with it.
One thing that I found with conspiracy theories as well is that there's a huge amount of credulity that goes on in terms of things that are anti-establishment. So somebody will complain about people trusting or rather being credulous to government sources, to sources in perceived authority or perceived imposed authority. However, they themselves are incredibly credulous to ideas that have no foundational support at all, such as sort of the one engineer in 100 that might say that there's absolutely no way that the World Trade Center could have fallen by itself, for example. And they'll believe that one outlier because they think that the underdog, the black sheep in it, is the one who's actually telling the truth, whereas everybody else is lying. So the consensus is by default false.
I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? If you assume that there's a massive cover-up going on, then you should expect that only, one out of the 100 is going to tell you the truth, because that person is brave and courageous, and everyone else is either a shill or has been bought out or is afraid to speak up. And that logic shows up in the climate change debate, too. The people who believe in climate change say, well, 97 or 98% of climate change scientists say it's real, which would be an overwhelming majority. But the other side comes back and says, well, that's not a real number. That's a fake number. And you're silencing the true majority of people who dissent from the climate change consensus. So it makes sense with those beliefs, right? It has to follow that if you think, there's a big conspiracy going on, you have to expect red herrings to be thrown in your way. You have to expect that evidence is going to be covered up or taken away. So it goes to follow that they are going to have different standards of evidence. And I'm willing to give that to a certain extent, but
do you think that's where this whole idea of alternative facts comes from, though? This idea that there's an entirely alternative set of facts that prove the opposite side that simply haven't been revealed yet. It goes back, I suppose, to the idea that there's this idea that's pervasive amongst a lot of conspiracy theorists that free energy exists, that free energy has been around for over 100 years, that it's been suppressed by the oil monopolies, the oil companies on the planet, so that oil can continue to be the most lucrative source of revenue for them. And this whole idea of hidden knowledge, of hidden facts, of an alternative truth seems to be something that's quite popular. However, nobody can show that it exists.
Yeah, and that's not the only reason why conspiracy theories exist. I mean, yes, that's true of a lot of people, but that assumes that they are leaning on the evidence, whatever evidence exists, to drive their beliefs. A lot of people, it's just going to come from this predisposition. So Wood, Douglas, and Sutton have a 2012 paper called Dead or Alive, where they show that, people who believe in one conspiratorial version of an event are also prone to believe another version of that same event, but that's logically contradictory. So a lot of people who believe that Osama bin Laden was dead, long before the Navy SEALs got to him, also believe that he's still alive. Can't make sense, right? So to me, a lot of these beliefs aren't based on getting good evidence or bad evidence or any evidence. It's just this predisposition to think that, okay, there are powerful people behind this, they abuse their power, and thus there's some sort of scheme going on. And many people psychologically would be happy to accept any scheme as an explanation for events and circumstances, because that's just how the world works. Powerful people abuse power, and there's stuff going on behind the scenes they don't want you to know.
Mm. Do you believe it's possible to so-called snap someone out of this sort of a mindset, or train them out of that, or do you think it's a sort of a physical, neurological sort of? Do you think basically that it's that predisposition is fixed, and that people will always be susceptible to it, or do you think there is a way of actually rationalizing, or not, like explaining things to people so that they can actually come to a better understanding of what the truth is and how to come to that truth?
Yeah, so there are a couple papers by Nyhan and Reifler where they try to give authoritative information to people who believe in death panels in Obama's healthcare bill, and I think the Obama is a Muslim conspiracy theory. And what they found was that when they gave people this information, not only did the conspiracy theorists reject it, but they doubled down on their belief in the conspiracy. So I guess you sort of have to tread very lightly. Now, where it looks like there's some glimmer of hope, there's a couple papers coming out now where it looks like people who are on the same side politically as the conspiracy theorist can get them to disavow their belief. So imagine if a Republican went to Republican climate change deniers, and said, listen, this is what the data says, climate change is real, and, we have to do something about it. That works. Having Democrats like Obama and Pelosi lecture them does not work, because they don't trust those people to begin with.
So it sounds like from that, they're very much sort of slaves in a way to what the people that they trust tell them.
Yeah, and this is something that political scientists have known for a long time. I mean, our predispositions are largely fixed. Yes, some people change parties, but most people, when they're 35, they're going to be what they are for the rest of their lives. Some people change, but most don't. The world can burn. People are going to vote the same way when they're 60 as when they're 30. So it's not like people are constantly reacting to information and changing their minds back and forth. Most people don't do that. So it's not a shock that if somebody views the world in conspiratorial terms, that they're just not going to change it. And it's not a shock that if somebody thinks 9/11 was blown up by the U.S. government, it's going to be difficult to change. And one thing we've known is that people tend to interpret the political world through people that they trust. People can choose their news sources, and then within those news sources, they could choose who they want to listen to. And they take cues from the people they trust. So that can be both a good thing and a bad thing.
Your work has been described as the first to provide a systematic assessment of more than a century's worth of U.S. conspiracy theories, where they come from, why people believe them. Can you describe the unique, original data sets you used and how you developed these data sets?
So when my co-author came to me and said, hey, let's do something on conspiracy theories, I spent a couple weeks looking around for data, and there really wasn't any. I mean, there were a few polls that have been taken sporadically about a handful of specific conspiracy beliefs, like belief in JFK conspiracies, belief in Jewish conspiracies, but really not too much. And certainly nothing that was systematic over time or systematic in terms of the question wording. And since many of the questions we wanted to answer had to do with over time changes, it became clear that we had to sort of think outside of the box and come up with something new. So we went to the letters to the editor section of the New York Times, and we took a sample of 1,000 letters per year over 120 years. So from 1890 to 2010. And we had our research assistants read those 120,000 letters and pick out the ones that fit our description of a conspiracy theory. And we found a few things from that. One, over time, the number of letters espousing or discussing conspiracy theories goes down. It's funny. Over the last 50 years, we can always find newspapers that say, oh my God, this is the new year of conspiracy theorizing. We've become a conspiratocracy. But our data suggests the opposite, that we're becoming less and less conspiratorial over time. And the other thing we find is a pattern that alternates with power. So that when a Republican is in power in the White House in the U.S., conspiracy theories tend to focus on Republicans and big business. And when a Democrat's in power, the conspiracy theories tend to focus on Democrats, communists, and socialists. So there's clearly a reaction to power that's going on here. So there's a big situational aspect to conspiracy theories. All of us have our beliefs and we don't always express them. So in that way, they're somewhat socially inert. But certain situations will arise where we will express them. People will express them more. And when people feel powerless, when people feel like there's a terrifying enemy coming to get them, they will start expressing these conspiracy theories more.
That also perhaps driven by the politicians.
So part of this conspiracy theories are for losers. Right. So when people are out of power, they will turn to conspiracy theories to help them in the face of what they consider to be danger. And this happens with politicians the same way it happens with regular people. Because our data, we were able to separate those letters written by elites from those letters written by regular folks. And what we found was they follow the same pattern over time. So it would not be a shock to me that over the next 4 years in the U.S. that you would have Democrats espousing a ton of conspiracy theories about Donald Trump.
I think that's probably already begun.
Oh yeah,
I've seen a few already.
Polls show this right now. Like 50% of Democrats believe that Putin rigged the voting machines in the election. There's zero evidence that happened. You have Paul Krugman, who's a popular columnist in the New York Times, claiming that there was a conspiracy with the head of the FBI and Putin to take down Hillary Clinton. And the list could go on and on. But what's so ironic about it is that the left, who was so happy to scorn the right for the last 8 years, has now become a bunch of conspiracy kooks.
Oh, that's interesting. Another thing that I was asked a few times to ask is there any correlation between, or is there any obvious correlation between religion and conspiracy theories? Because we do have obvious things when it comes to politics, but religion is something that people always assume can lead to conspiracy theories due to the belief of the potentially irrational beliefs in the supernatural. But do you actually find that in your data?
No, and we didn't spend a lot of time on it. And part of the reason was in our surveys we had about 1,200 respondents. But you have, numerous categories of religious affiliation multiplied by how much the people actually take part in it or believe in it or feel spiritual or faithful in any way. So we just didn't feel like we had enough data to get into that question too much. We do have more data coming, so we'll spend a little more time on it in the future. But if I had to stake a claim now, I would say I would almost guarantee that being a member of certain religions will drive which conspiracy theories you'll believe in. But I don't think that being religious or being a member of a particular faith controls the number of conspiracy theories you believe in. And just to give basic evidence on it, I think that, the left in this country, what my data shows is that they're just as conspiratorial in their thinking as the right. But the left tends to be much less church-going and much less into the religion than the right.
I've heard them described as the atheist left many times recently, and especially in this election, which I think quite interesting.
So there's two forces that kind of maintain the stability over time of conspiratorial beliefs in society, socialization and the distribution of power, both of which we've been talking about a little bit. What are the dynamic elements within that allow for anomalies to crop up every now and then?
So in our data, we showed spikes in the 1890s and in the 1950s in conspiratorial thinking in the U.S. And what we surmise is that those spikes came about because people of all political stripes were able to focus on a singular enemy at a particular time. So in the 1890s, people were scared of big business and big monopoly trusts. And in the early 1890s, business hadn't become really a part of either party's political coalition. It wasn't really until 1896, 1897, where business joins the Republican Party with the candidacy of William McKinley. And what we find in 1897 is at that point, all of a sudden, conspiracy talk about big business just cuts in half from where it was for the previous few years. We find the same thing in the 1950s, where you have, both Republicans and Democrats can be fearful of communists and socialists. But as time went on, the far, far left, the communists and socialists, were sort of accepted by the Democratic Party as part of its coalition. And at that point, only Republicans retained the fear of communist takeover, and Democrats lost that fear.
So it would make sense then that you find these spikes in the overall stability and overall pattern happen because these spikes only happen when there's a cooperation or a unity of bipartisan support for fear of power. And those spikes are rare because that kind of bipartisan cooperation is something that can only happen when rare events shake up the whole society. Is that what we're to understand?
Yeah, so if we put this in context of recent popular conspiracy theories, I mean, in the U.S., if we were to say, what are the two most popular recent conspiracy theories, we'd probably say the birther theory that Obama faked his birth certificate, and the truther theory that Bush or the bankers or the Jews were behind 9/11. In both cases, those theories maxed out at about 25-30%. Because for the most part, only one party or the other was going to believe in either theory. And only about half of each party was going to buy into each of those theories. So that's why you get, in a partisan conspiracy theory, you max out around 25-30%. Now, the one exception that I would say to this, and it makes perfect sense why, is the JFK conspiracy theories. And that's because when they ask questions about JFK, the survey questions are usually worded as, do you think there was a conspiracy or a cover-up in the assassination of President Kennedy? And you get about 60% now that say yes. If you go back to the late 90s, you had about 80% saying yes. The reason why that number is so high is because you pretty much have everybody with a conspiratorial mindset saying yes to that question. Once you drill down a little bit more and say, do you think it was Castro or Lyndon Johnson or the Russians or the CIA, then you get a lot more disagreement, so that each possible villain gets only about 5 to 10% of that 60%. But other than those, that sort of exception, it's really about 25% you're going to max out.
Mine are more to do with like specific conspiracy theories. So I was just wondering if there were any specific conspiracy theories that you sort of dove deeper into, or whether it was more an overall thing that you were looking at.
Our purpose was to throw a really big net and catch the big fish and the small fish. And I think that's what the value is that we added, is that we didn't want to just focus on one or a few. We wanted to pull everything in. So if readers go to the book, you can see some of the, we talk about some of the data we have where one thing you find is that there are millions of conspiracy theories out there. We only talk about, a handful of them. But there's millions out there. Most come and go in the night. They don't get websites. They don't get polled. They don't get a large following. So some of the ones that we came across were, the CIA created a lesbianism, or Congress wants to kill our pet dog. Congress wants to kill our pet dogs. So there's a lot out there. I mean, if you were to scour the internet, you'd find conspiracy theories about all sorts of crazy stuff. But it's only a few that we really hear about, and even fewer than those that will garner more than a few percentage points of belief.
There are some that are really extreme, such as, I mean, regular listeners of this show will be well aware of flat Earth theory, for example, which for some reason has got a lot of press recently, along with things like concave Earth theory and hollow Earth theory and various other ridiculous ones where they seem to be pervasive. They seem to sort of linger, some of these, for over a century now, simply because they rely on people believing their own senses and not believing anything beyond that, which is kind of interesting in it. What are your thoughts on the ones that kind of linger that are
Yeah,
so
I guess if you were to poll on some of these, you would probably find that the number of people who believe them is very small. To give you one example, the latest poll I saw on the faked moon landing was that only about 6% of Americans believe in that. But that's a very popular...
That's still a large number.
Yeah, and in some senses, yes, in some senses, no. I mean, it's a fairly popular conspiracy theory. If you'd ask people, name some of the popular American conspiracy theories, the moon landing would most certainly come up, but what you find is that, almost nobody believes in it. 6% is really not that much. I guess the ones that concern me more are the ones where people are actually taking action on them, like, we're going to reject vaccines, and depending on how you ask the question, you can get up to 20% of people saying that they think vaccines are linked to autism. So to me, that's more scary. I mean, the last poll I saw of people believing in reptilian lizard overlords, I mean, that showed about 4% believed in that. And I think that number is probably high. My guess is the poll has a plus or minus of 3.5. And so it's probably closer to 0.5 rather than 4%. But, David Icke, who propagates this lizard people theory, I mean, he has a small following of people that pay a lot of money to go see him and talk about the lizard people. So this sort of reasoning exists out there where people, get into bad ideas. I mean, I don't think it's a terrible thing to have people get into different ideas. That's fine, right? I mean, there's no way to know which ideas are good until they are all allowed to go out and play against each other and compete in an open field, right? So, I mean, what we're finding in the case of the lizard people or in the case of the moon landing is that, these bad ideas aren't getting much traction. And that's a good thing. It does disconcert me that other ones do get more traction.
What would be your advice to someone who's perhaps got a family member or a friend who is going down that route, going down the rabbit hole of getting into deeper and more ridiculous conspiracy theories, but who doesn't perhaps share the same political stance as yourself? What would be your advice to try and talk them around, if that's even possible?
I don't know how much there is to do. I guess you can give them the best evidence there is, but at the end of the day, people are going to believe what they want to believe. And that goes for non-conspiratorial ideas too. I mean, people get stuck in their ideas and they often won't change. So I often wonder, why do people change what they do? It's sort of a broad question. Because people tend to get stuck on these things. I don't know why. Like my grandmother, she used to rub butter on my sunburns. That's a terrible idea. And if she had the opportunity, she would probably still do the same thing. I don't know why.
I hope you weren't lactose intolerant.
Yeah, I mean, with all the evidence to the contrary, you would think that people would update what they do, but I think it's only in limited circumstances that people change.
It's my understanding that the reason we hear most about the conspiracy theories that don't have a lot of followers, like we hear a lot about the moon landing, as you said, and David Icke's reptilian stuff, is those are just the most interesting, and those are the ones that the media likes to talk about because they're crazy and weird. But that also plays into the stereotypes of what conspiracy theories are and who believes them. And your book and your work shatters, I think, and does a good job of shattering a lot of the stereotypes surrounding conspiracy theories. And I myself was surprised by what you found, and it kind of shook up some of my assumptions that I held without knowing they were unfounded assumptions. that people just hold about who they are. So can you describe who conspiracy theorists are and what some of the stereotypes are that you've found don't hold up?
So if you were to close your eyes for a moment and imagine that stereotypical conspiracy theorist, probably going to be somebody who's white, middle-aged, hanging out in a basement with a ham radio, male, and some sort of conservative politics, perhaps radically so. But what the data shows is something entirely different. I mean, first we find that men and women are about equal in their conspiracy thinking. A good example of this is the show The View in the U.S., which is a popular women's show hosted by a rotating cast of female hosts. I mean, of the hosts on that show, Whoopi Goldberg has expressed belief in moon landing conspiracy theories. Rosie O'Donnell believes that jet fuel can't melt steel. And Jenny McCarthy thinks that there's a conspiracy to hide the negative effects of vaccines from people. So it's, men and women are about equal. People of all races engage in conspiracy thinking and in somewhat similar levels. And most importantly, and I think most controversially, we find that people on both sides of the political aisle engage in conspiracy thinking in exactly the same levels. And neither side wants to accept that, particularly the left. I mean, the left has spent the last 8 years in the U.S. talking about how the right is a bunch of conspiracy kooks and that they're unhinged. And now they are a bunch of unhinged conspiracy kooks themselves. So it's a bitter irony for them now. It just shows the situational aspect of conspiracy theories, is that now that they are, essentially completely out of power, they've turned to conspiracy theories, which is a completely natural thing to do. The right did the same thing during the last 8 years, but now it's the left's turn.
Have you ever been convinced by something that you now consider a conspiracy theory? And if so, what was it and how did you get past that?
When I was younger, I was really big into Oliver Stone's JFK. Like, I watched it a bunch of times and I thought it was really fascinating. And what I found was the more I watched it, the more I saw that it was just completely implausible, even on its own terms. Beside the fact that Oliver Stone just even admits to making up a whole ton of stuff. And even some of the stuff he says is true, we know is false. But even beyond that, I mean, just the movie doesn't make sense on its own premises if you watch it very closely. So I used to be in the JFK theories, but at this point, it's 53 years later and we haven't caught the real killer. It's like time to move on, So that's one that I used to be into. I mean, occasionally there were things where I will see where I'm concerned. So, for example, the IRS targeting of conservatives, which became an issue in early 2013, where it looked like the IRS was going after conservative groups and their tax-exempt status in the U.S. And amazingly, all of the emails disappeared, all the computers disappeared, all the backup tapes disappeared, and then all the backup to the backup tapes disappeared. And nobody knew what happened. So it's not that conspiracies never happen. I just think the ones that do sort of miss our gaze sometimes.
This insight that all of us believe in at least one conspiracy theory, whether we have consciously articulated or expressed it or not, gives us pause and opportunity for introspection and critical self-evaluation. Have you discovered any conspiracy theories that you currently believe? That's a question I've asked myself, and it's a hard question for me to answer because as soon as you recognize something as a conspiracy theory, by the very definition of conspiracy theory, you don't necessarily believe it for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, except for a small number of people who wear the badge of conspiracy theorist proudly. Those people are happy to say, well, I believe in conspiracy theories, but also because they are true. For most people, they don't wear that badge, and they just assume that their beliefs are true. They don't categorize them as conspiracy theories. So imagine you did a poll and said, do you believe in conspiracy theories? Most people will say no. But then when you start asking about specific ones, then you'll get people saying, oh, yeah, I believe this and that. What polls find sometimes is that pollsters can make up conspiracy theories out of whole cloth. And you'll have people saying that they not only have heard of it, but they believe in it. So it just goes to show that people with a conspiracy mentality will believe anything, any theory that has conspiracy logic spelled out in it. One area of discontent I have right now with other researchers is that, there's one big line that's going around with some of the other people working on the topic, and that is that, they tend to say 50% of Americans believe in a conspiracy theory. Well, that number has to be much higher than that, because what they're basing that number on is going out and asking people about their belief in a handful of conspiracy theories. In truth, there are millions out there. So the odds that everyone believes in one is incredibly high. And the odds that pollsters are capturing all the ones that people believe in is incredibly low. So, again, we always have to be cognizant that when we have these conversations about conspiracy theories, we're generally talking about one or a few, when in fact there's a lot of smaller fish out there. We shouldn't just judge the iceberg by what we see above the water. We have to understand what's going on underneath, too.
Do you think there's any pragmatic value to conspiratorial thinking? You write in your book about conspiracy theories being potentially early alarm systems or functioning as threat perception to prepare people for international or domestic danger. Has there ever been any major or even minor historical events where the conspiracy theorists have turned out to be right, and even if they couldn't support their beliefs with logic and evidence, it turned out to help them out in some way to deal with some external threat?
So, conspiracy theorists can have a lot of value even if they're not right. I mean, we know of instances where people who believe in a conspiracy theory and investigate it have been right. So think of Woodward and Bernstein. They follow a conspiracy theory to bring down a sitting president. Okay, but there are other instances where conspiracy theorists might not be right, but they do us a service anyway. So conspiracy theorists have pushed for more information to be released about the JFK assassination. And that's a good thing, because now we know more than we did before. And we should know more about it. There's no reason for documents to be kept secret. So, in that sense, they often do us a service. Sometimes conspiracy theorists do a service without even knowing it. And that is that by having a group of people out there who are so cynical and are going to push back against any authoritative narrative, it keeps authorities on their toes. It makes it so that powerful people know that they are going to be watched by a certain part of the population who is going to start with the assumption that the powerful are doing their worst. So, those are good attributes of conspiracy theories, and I think we often focus on the negative part, focusing on how people have wrong beliefs and whatnot. But there is a value in these things. I mean, Democrats are going to be a bunch of loons when it comes to conspiracy theories over the next 4 years. They've already started, but I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing. They are out of power. They need a rallying cry. Right? They are essentially seeing themselves in a face of danger from a powerful enemy. The Republicans control the House, the Senate, the presidency, and will soon have ideological control of the court. So, it makes sense for Democrats to turn to these theories to rally their troops and to establish a narrative for why they need to come together and push back. That's not a terrible thing. It's not a terrible thing even if some of their ideas are wrong.
Well, one thing that's come clear recently as well is, and is being spoken about a lot, especially in left-wing newspapers, is this idea that what actually won the president for Donald Trump was conspiracy theories, was things that were driven primarily by sources such as Breitbart and major sort of so-called alternative news sources and fake news sources. Is that something that you think is true? As in, do you think that conspiracy theories actually did win the president, and this manipulation of people who are predisposed to believe in conspiracy theories? Or do you think that is in itself a conspiracy theory driven by leftist politicians and leftist news sources to try and discredit the win?
I think it's the latter. I have a piece that just came out in Reason magazine called Fake News Freakout. And in it, I argue that people are freaking out over fake news, and they probably shouldn't. And blaming the win of Donald Trump on fake news is sort of misplaced blame. These alternative sources of news don't get nearly the amount of visitors that, the Washington Post or the New York Times get. I mean, that's why they're alternative. I mean, if you look up where people are spending their time on the internet, if you look at internet traffic, I mean, it goes to all mainstream places and pornography, long before it goes to conspiracy theory websites. So it's not the case that everyone's on the internet looking at fake news. It's not the case that everyone's looking at Breitbart or Alex Jones's InfoWars. It's just not the case. Those are small sites that get far less people than the big non-conspiratorial places. And, let me say something very interesting, is that people tend to think of 2016 as a conspiracy theory election, but it wasn't because of Trump, or it wasn't just because of Trump. I mean, we had two major candidates that were conspiracy theorists. One was Donald Trump, who, if you string all of his conspiracy theories together, they essentially make one narrative, and that is that our political class has sold out regular Americans to globalist and foreign interests. If you put everything together, that's what it boils down to. The other one was Bernie Sanders, who pushed the conspiracy theory that a small group of people, and let me quote him directly as best I can, a small group of people who has a greed that knows no end, who are making it hard for us to survive, control our political and economic systems. That group, of course, is the 1%. Yeah, so
sounds the same.
I mean, both of them based their candidacies on a conspiracy theory, and both of them got about 40% of their party's respective vote in the primaries. The reason why Trump won his party's nomination and Bernie didn't was because Bernie was up against one candidate, Trump was against 22, who essentially divided the establishment vote. So, if you put it in that way, the circumstances for Trump to have gotten where he is, I mean, it just relied on a lot of, accidental circumstances. So I wouldn't read into this and say, oh my God, people are wanting to elect conspiracy theorists. No, you have sort of a stable number of people who are conspiracy thinking within each party. And normally the establishment will win out, but it just didn't in this one circumstance with the Republican nomination. But if you go ahead in time and look at what Hillary Clinton was talking about, out of one side of her mouth, she was saying Donald Trump's an unhinged conspiracy theorist. Out of the other side of her mouth, she was spewing conspiracy theories too, whenever it suited her. So, this was most interesting. One day where she gave a speech talking about Donald Trump and his conspiracy theories and how it made him unfit for office. Her campaign then pushed a conspiracy theory about how Trump was Putin's pawn in some sort of scheme. So she is not generally a conspiracy theorist. She's a much more establishment person. But Hillary Clinton has used conspiracy theories whenever it suited her.
So it's interesting to know that MILF porn is actually still much more popular than conspiracy theories. So what we could drive from that, if we wanted to do a false correlation, is that MILF porn won Donald Trump the election, potentially.
Well, you don't know. Maybe it did.
There's a conspiracy theory.
What has been the response to your work by other researchers, and how is your work being picked up and improved upon?
Well, I think the biggest impact we've had so far is with our conspiracy theories are for losers argument. And I know that people in political science and social psychology have taken to that and have done a lot of surveys and experiments to sort of test that out to see if it holds true. And it looks like it's holding up pretty well. So I'm happy to say that that's the case. I think the work has been received very well by most empirical researchers. I do get some pushback by authors who have worked on the topic from a more qualitative perspective, or those who take a more cultural approach to conspiracy theories, but that's fine. My hope is that, when we wrote the book, we didn't assume that we were right about everything, but what we wanted to do was to take what questions existed out there and had a bunch of answers that weren't supported by evidence, and then try to bring evidence to bear. And we wanted to use that evidence to get the best answers we could. Now, we hope that over time that there will be better evidence and hopefully better answers. So we welcome people coming in and researching this. And, if we're proved wrong on some of the things that we say, then so be it. I just hope that we would have pushed us towards better answers over time.
Interesting. Have you had much feedback from conspiracy theorists themselves, as in major players? Have you had anyone like David Icke or David Avocado Wolf or anyone like that come back at you or speak about you?
And in that sense, I've sort of flown under the radar. And part of the reason for that, as we've already discussed, is that I don't bash conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists. Like, I try to be as neutral as possible. And I always give conspiracy theorists their due credit and say that they do perform a good function in society. So I don't think there's any reason for any of them to get upset with my work or what I do. I don't start from the place that says, okay, these people have wrong beliefs. Let's find out what's wrong with them. That's not what I do. I just want to know why people believe what they believe, right? So, of course, there are going to be reasons for this that go beyond evidence. I mean, think of it in terms of, if I wanted to know why people were Jewish or Catholic or whatever, I wouldn't start with the premise that, let's figure out which holy book is the correct one. And then we'll know which group of parishioners has the right evidence on their side. That's not where we would start. We'd probably start with, were these people brought up in a Catholic household or a Buddhist household or whatever household? And that would probably explain why they held their beliefs, right? So it's not so much evidence that's driving it in that case. And we would all agree that it's their socialization. So it shouldn't be that shocking to hear that socialization drives a lot of our other beliefs too.
That's an interesting point to make, which is that objective impartiality and trying not to take any sides is probably a very good way to go about this, if not only because you're going to get more discussion on more sort of outpouring of information from either side if you don't voice an opinion against what they're believing. And instead try to coax out of them a little bit more information about why they believe what they believe and what precisely defines their beliefs.
Yes. And again, in sort of being neutral, I mean, I don't want to just focus on why do people believe in a conspiracy belief. I think another really good question is, why don't people believe in particular conspiracy theories? Why don't they? Sometimes it would seem as if the evidence is built up to a point where they should believe it. And the question is, why don't they? Right? A great example of this is like when somebody on your political side is accused of wrongdoing, we tend to excuse them. Say, no, that doesn't happen, or that's not really a crime, or that's fine. But when the other side does it, oh my God, it's, the worst thing ever. So I think there were instances where people probably should be open to the conspiracy belief, but for a handful of reasons are naive to it.
There's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance that comes into it, isn't there? I mean, any strongly held belief is difficult to get out of, and it's also difficult to question for some people. It took me years to question a lot of my beliefs. It took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that a lot of my beliefs were completely incorrect and that my view of the world was wrong. And that was because of the position that I was in, because I'd lived a very solitary life. And as a result of that, I'd built up certain beliefs about society, about the way things were, that were completely incorrect because I hadn't had that experience. So that cognitive dissonance, for me at least, it's not something that you can just snap out of. It's not something that you can just wake up one day and go, oh shit, I was wrong about everything, and then just carry on with your life. You have to gradually unlearn certain things.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you think about political beliefs in particular, our partisan lenses through which we view the world are incredibly thick. So, we just don't take them off. I mean, what we find is that party drives, our party identification drives so many of the things that we do in life without us even knowing it. It drives who we trust, what news we watch, what products we buy, what music we listen to, what other sorts of non-political people we believe, what other non-political opinions do we hold. I mean, our worldview is very thick. And those worldviews, and each of us has many of them, political, religious, racial, class, etc., we have these, and in order for us to hold a belief, what we find, in order for us to hold a conspiracy belief, that conspiracy theory has to match up with all of those things. So imagine a strict Catholic is not going to buy into Da Vinci Code theories, precisely because Catholics aren't going to buy the idea that Jesus fathered a child with a prostitute and then that child became a French king, something like that. They're not going to buy into it. But people who are into New Age thinking will buy into it. But in either case, no one is really looking at the evidence. They're both just sort of following their already held beliefs and coming to conclusions about other things based on those underlying beliefs. So it's not evidence. It's those worldviews that drive it.
So you talk about power asymmetries driving the ebb and flow of conspiratorial beliefs over time, and specifically malevolent conspiracy theories. Do you think there's application in what your research has found for benevolent conspiracy theories? I know Jesse Walker has a whole chapter in his book, The United States of Paranoia, about people who believe that there's a benevolent, angelic conspiracy of higher beings or government officials trying to help us and make our lives better. Do you think there's application in your research for...
We don't get into it. And even in our definition of conspiracy theory, we sort of leave that sort of thinking behind. Because I'm not sure that it constitutes a conspiracy theory in a way that we're concerned with. So the conspiracy theories that I care about are ones that scapegoat, a particular group, and that claims that group is doing something behind the scenes that's against the common good and for their own benefit. I mean, if you believe that doctors are working in secret to cure cancer for the sake of all humanity, then that's great. That's wishful thinking, but it's not. I don't view that as a conspiracy theory in the way that I'm concerned with it. I want to know who's accusing who of doing something bad in secret. So I sort of leave those sort of wishful thinking things behind. Mm-hmm. Like occasionally I'll see some sort of wishful thinking come out packaged in a conspiracy. Like somebody's already invented an engine that runs on banana peels and it will save us all from destroying the planet. But the oil companies have hidden it from us. Yeah.
Apart from with banana forests.
I think we've been going for about an hour, so I think we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. In closing, why would you say that, or would you say that conspiracy theories are necessary to study from a sociological and political angle? And if so, why are they important to study?
Well, after Richard Hofstadter's book, The Paranoid Style, came out in the early 1960s, there wasn't too much work on the topic. And you have some historians looking at it, and then you had some scholars of literature and culture looking at it in the 1990s. But you don't really get a ton of political scientists, sociologists, and psychologists in on the topic until more recently. Because these views are so widespread, they are incredibly important to study. And because they focus on ideas about power and truth, they're important to study, because those are opinions that really matter in democracies. I mean, we want to know, what do people think about who has power and what are they doing with it? Those are important things to know in a democratic society. If people view those things wrongly, then that's a concern, and social scientists should bring that out. So that's why I think that conspiracy theories are important to study. And I'm very happy to say that over the last 10 years or so, the study of this topic has really exploded. And there's a lot of really great scholars working on it now.
I think with that, we'll wrap up our show for today. We want to extend a very special thanks to our guest, Dr. Joseph Uscinski, for taking time out of your day to join us.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's been really interesting today. And,
great, thanks for having me. I look forward to
reading some more of your work in the future.
And we have a few items of business to get out of the way before we close out. We have a Patreon for our dedicated listeners who want to support us with a donation of $5 per episode or more. That gets you access to exclusive content, extended interviews, early access to shows before they go public. And remember to leave us a review on iTunes or on whatever platform you listen to us on. That helps us out. And we want to give a special thanks to our current patrons, Microbloganism. Check out his YouTube channel. And thank you, Microbloganism, and Josh at the Society for the Advancement of Science. Thank you both for your support. It's much appreciated. And with that, that's all I have to say. Thanks, Dr. Uscinski, and thank you, Jen, for joining us, and I'll see you later.
See you later. So it's interesting to know that MILF porn is actually still much more popular than conspiracy theories. So what we could drive from that, if we wanted to do a false correlation, is that MILF porn won Donald Trump the election, potentially.
Well, you don't know. Maybe it did.
Hello and welcome to Trolling with Logic, where we bring the hammer down on pseudoscience, ignorance, and unreason on a bi-weekly basis. I'm Nathan, your host. Cal and Kitch both were unable to join us for this episode, so today it's just me and Jen. How you doing, Jen?
I'm not too bad, thanks. Just working on a few projects, trying to keep the Illuminati at bay.
Joining us today is our special guest on this episode, Dr. Joseph Uscinski. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami, and his current research focuses on conspiratorial beliefs, which is the topic of this episode. He is the author of The People's News, Media, Politics, and the Demands of Capitalism, and co-author with Joseph Parent of American Conspiracy Theories from Oxford University Press. His research has appeared in several scholarly outlets, including the Journal of Politics, Political Research Quarterly, and Critical Review. Welcome to the show, Dr. Uscinski.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you.
That only, one out of the 100 is going to tell you the truth, because that person is brave and courageous, and everyone else is either a shill or has been bought out or is afraid to speak up. And that logic shows up in the climate change debate, too. The people who believe in climate change say, well, 97 or 98% of climate change scientists say it's real, which would be an overwhelming majority. But the other side comes back and says, well, that's not a real number. That's a fake number. And you're silencing the true majority of people who dissent from the climate change consensus. So it makes sense with those beliefs, right? It has to follow that if you think, there's a big conspiracy going on, you have to expect red herrings to be thrown in your way. You have to expect that evidence is going to be covered up or taken away. So it goes to follow that they are going to have different standards of evidence. And I'm willing to give that to a certain extent, but
Do you think that's where this whole idea of alternative facts comes from, though? This idea that there's an entirely alternative set of facts that prove the opposite side that simply haven't been revealed yet. It goes back, I suppose, to the idea that there's this idea that's pervasive amongst a lot of conspiracy theorists that free energy exists, that free energy has been around for over 100 years, that it's been suppressed by the oil monopolies, the oil companies on the planet, so that oil can continue to be the most lucrative source of revenue for them. And this whole idea of hidden knowledge, of hidden facts, of an alternative truth seems to be something that's quite popular. However, nobody can show that it exists.
Yeah, and that's not the only reason why conspiracy theories exist. I mean, yes, that's true of a lot of people, but that assumes that they are leaning on the evidence, whatever evidence exists, by the CIA to delegitimize conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you start from that point, you're not going to get very far. And then when I write publicly in a newspaper or something, I'll scan the comments that readers will make, and a lot of the comments from conspiracy theorists will allege that I'm part of the conspiracy, that I'm somehow trying to stop free thought or free debate, or I'm a shill for the establishment. And trust me, I'm not. So
we've had Vance on before, and he's been accused of that as well.
Yeah. So people get very touchy about these beliefs. And it's not all people. I mean, everyone believes in at least one conspiracy theory. Most people probably believe in a few, even if they don't know it. But most people aren't getting upset about the discussion of conspiracy theory. It's certain people who are very much into their beliefs that will take umbrage with it.
One thing that I found with conspiracy theories as well is that there's a huge amount of credulity that goes on in terms of things that are anti-establishment. So somebody will complain about people trusting or rather being credulous to government sources, to sources in perceived authority or perceived imposed authority. However, they themselves are incredibly credulous to ideas that have no foundational support at all, such as sort of the one engineer in 100 that might say that there's absolutely no way that the World Trade Center could have fallen by itself, for example. And they'll believe that one outlier because they think that the underdog, the black sheep in it, is the one who's actually telling the truth, whereas everybody else is lying. So the consensus is by default false.
I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? If you assume that there's a massive cover-up going on, then you should expect
a pretty wide gap, or attempts to bridge a pretty wide gap. And where would you say the difficulty comes in?
Well, I give a lot of public talks, and I'll tell you, many people are not convinced of what I say, and not because of anything that I say, but because they have their own conspiracy beliefs that keep them from buying into what I'm talking about. So the reason this happens is because people like to assume that their beliefs are based on sound reasoning and good evidence. Otherwise, we wouldn't hold that belief, right? So when I tell people that, these conspiracy beliefs come from some other place, that isn't based on logic and evidence, they often get offended. So it's hard to have these conversations with people. And I often get confronted by, sometimes it's truthers, sometimes it's birthers. But in any case, it's conspiracy theorists, people who believing in these things don't want to think that it's not evidence that's driving them. That's why it's so hard to have, serious public conversations about it.
And it's interesting that conspiracy theorists, for the most part, as you say, do believe that their views are based on an impartial interpretation of evidence. But at the same time, what I see following different conspiracy theories, because it's one of my special fascinations and special interests in looking into these things, is that they seem to reject the study of their beliefs. It's almost as if they don't want their beliefs subjected to critical scrutiny, but at the same time, they do believe that their views are based on something more than speculation.
Sure. So, this comes out in different ways. So there's a popular conspiracy theory that the word conspiracy theory is itself part of a conspiracy.
As I said, we're talking about conspiracy theories in society, and your research specifically focuses on conspiracy beliefs as they crop up in America specifically. To start, there's an important concept you introduce in your book that's based on the psychological work of other people called the conspiracy dimension, and this has been developed by Rob Brotherton, Chris French, and others. Can you describe what the conspiracy dimension is and how it plays into what we're talking about?
So the basic idea is that some people, to one degree or another, are predisposed to believing in conspiracy theories or to not believing in conspiracy theories. So my guess is, and there isn't much research to back this up because psychologists, social psychologists, and political scientists have only been working on the topic for about a decade now. My guess is that this predisposition comes from childhood socialization, just like many of our other political predispositions come from. So if you think about conspiracy theories as explanations of power, who has it and what are they doing with it, it fits in very well to ideas about partisanship or political ideology, other ideas that essentially get to, the notion of who's good and who's bad, who's doing the right thing, which team should we be part of. So since ideas like partisanship and ideology come out of socialization, I assume, unfortunately without much evidence, that this is where this conspiracy thinking, as I call it, comes from.
Why do you think conspiracy theories are difficult to study? The research you and Parent have done kind of bridges